Good morning to the EBnet community. This is Leon Greyling of EBnet Stream. I'm delighted to bring to you today the first in an installment, a new series on EBnet Stream called Power Plays and Paydays, where we're going beyond the usual just talking about economics, investments, and retirement-related matters, but focusing in on the political impact that influences our markets and outcomes for our members. South Africa is a country that you can't simply ignore the politics. You can't divorce it from the economic situation. The two are interchanged. We need to ensure that we understand the impact of the political situation and what that might mean in the future for our members and their investment returns. So I'm delighted to introduce you to Bheki Mahlobo, who will be joining me in this series as we move forward on a monthly basis to talk specifically about the political situation, but what that means for investment opportunity for South Africans, as well as how the global picture impacts South Africa as well. So I hope to get into the meat of it. I hope to speculate a little bit about what we can expect going forward. But in the case of Bheki, it's more than speculation. It's well-researched opinion that he'll be providing. Bheki is from Frans Cronje Private Clients. Bheki will share with us now a little bit on his background and the background of Frans Cronje and that business. Bheki, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Leon, it's a great pleasure to be on your show. Looking forward to the discussion that we have, as well as the topics we're going to deep dive into today. And good morning to your listeners and watchers as well.
So we're going to make it meaty. Do you have meaty stuff for us?
I do have meaty stuff for us. You know, where I come from, we love meat. I'm a Xhosa man. I come from the rural parts of Eastern Cape. Gravel road and everything, where the nearest town is about an hour away, the nearest hospital is about an hour and 30 minutes away. And we're elevated as my family is in the mountain somewhere 2 hours away from Jamestown. That's where my home is, but I got educated in Johannesburg. But the culture amongst us is that we're heavy meat eaters. We don't consider a meal unless there's meat in it. And also in this discussion, there will be quite a lot of meat, as we like to delve into the numbers. We like to delve in the numbers for the politics, the economic trajectory of South Africa, but as well as the opportunities that lay on the table for the country. Bit of background about who I am. As I've said, I come from the Eastern Cape, got educated in Johannesburg, where I self-studied under UNISA. I then went for an internship under the Center for Risk Analysis at the time on which Dr. Frans Cronje was heading, moved to being an analyst and an economist within the think tank, pivoted towards financial markets, working for a private consulting firm called ETM, which is a private consulting firm servicing your major commercial banks as other fund managers, as I wanted to be deep-rooted in financial markets and actually understand how markets move. From that point on, I've had discussions with Frans as well as with Sherwin, who is our head of marketing, in order to establish a private consulting firm under the name Dr. Frans Cronje Private Clients, Frans Cronje Private Clients, FCPC. And under this firm, I serve as a partner as well as an economist within the firm, and we service your listed companies ranging from manufacturing, agriculture, whatever company that finds itself operating in South Africa as well as around the world that wants to know the politics of the country, that wants to know the economic trajectory of South Africa, as well as that on hard calls as to the elections. Another position that I hold is that I serve on the board of the Social Research Foundation, of which Dr. Frans Cronje chairs. We do polling data, and we've been doing that for the past 2.5 years, which is what we'll also discuss today. And I'm based in the US as and completing my master's in economics. The core pillar of Frans Cronje Private Clients is that we make hard calls on the politics and the economic trajectory of the country. And the way you can gain value from us is a constant engagement with us. We do briefings, we do calls, we do conversations of what we're having today, and we talk on the numbers. We don't have opinions. We look at what are the numbers saying, and it's the numbers that guide us towards our hard calls, which we've gotten right as well.
So, Bheki, interesting, who are the typical customers of Frans Cronje Private Clients?
Yeah, so the typical customers of Frans Private Clients is your listed companies, your Fortune 500 companies, your big multi-corporations, as well as that of your small corporations as well. We like talking to everyone. We do also talk towards the government, but we don't take any money from sovereign government. So our clients are 100% private. It's your biggest firms as well as your smallest firms, ranging from across industries, as these firms face the same issues as a small company with 50 employees, as well as that with thousands of employees. And that is the economic realities on the ground in South Africa, as well as the politics of the country, which affects their bottom line. So it ranges from your manufacturing firms, your agriculture firms, as well as asset management firms as well.
So to me, that's the part that obviously interests me the most. I mean, asset managers are driving a significant part of the private capital in South Africa, and a lot of that money is flowing offshore through now that exchange controls have been relaxed and so on. And these asset managers are making calls on the markets and the direction of those capital flows. That influences member outcomes, and trustees have oversight in that respect. So I would be expecting the asset management community, asset managers of all sizes, to have a very strong view on the geopolitics and the impact on the investment or economic scenarios. So maybe if we could, let's start there, because when we were off air, you mentioned or you spoke about the positive opportunities that the current environment is bringing to South Africa. So perhaps we can delve into that a little bit and then start coming back to where I suppose most people's minds are, which is a little bit of disenchantment and what on earth is going on from a political situation and how that might be impacting.
Yeah, so I think a great starting point for us, Leon, is to actually look at what is the broader economic way of the land in the country. And the great starting point to this is that we can start off with the currency. The currency would lead us towards inflation. The inflation would lead us towards interest rates. That would lead us towards the broader economic landscape of the country. And that will perfectly align us to the politics, as well as the economic opportunities that I think South Africa may be looking ahead of. So should we take full advantage of what's on the table? Firstly, if you look at the South African rand, it has appreciated by more than 4% since the beginning of the year. It's actually trading near the levels seen since the formation of the GNU about last year. And the result of that is that the rand trades largely based on external factors, such as that of the dollar, which is weakened by a great extent, lower oil prices, which has helped to appreciate the South African currency, as well as what we're seeing now with an improvement in global risk sentiment, largely due to what we've seen in the Middle East. So investors' concerns have been eased, and that has led to emerging market currencies like the rand to take full advantage of that. What does that exactly mean? Well, it means that it allows the Lesetja Kganyago to continue his cutting of interest rates in South Africa. South Africa will continue to see further rate cuts in the country, and that will ease the spending purse of South African households. However, if you look at it as well, compared to US interest rates, they remain quite historically high. US rates remain above the levels seen in 2020, as well as that of the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2009. And what that means is that South African interest rates needs to be maintained quite at a higher level than US interest rates in order for South Africa to justify the capital being invested in the country, be it through portfolio flows or South African assets. This means that the rate of rate cuts in the country is quite limited, and our number for economic growth in the country remains at about 0.8% this year. That's a very low number if we compare it to other emerging markets, which are approaching close to 4%, global GDP, that's about 3%. And largely, the basis for that number is the underlying indicators suggest a 0.8% GDP growth rate in South Africa, and that is that of fixed investment. South Africa's fixed investment now sits at about 15% as a proportion of GDP, which has declined from 2008, as well as that if you look at under other indicators, the likes of consumer confidence, consumer spending is about 60% of South Africa's economy. That is even lower than when it was in 2008, as well as that of the commitment by businesses. If you look at business confidence, which is below the peak years of South Africa's economic success between 2004 as well as 2007. Those indicators suggest that the economic realities of South Africa remains of the 10-year economic average of about 0.8%. So in terms of the economics, it's not looking too great.
Sorry, just on that quickly, what was the target that the government set in terms of economic growth?
In terms of the South African government, well, National Treasury has it at about 2% as of February. They've revised it lower to about 1.4%. Our number remained the same since February, which was about 0.8%.
And what is the estimate in order to create an environment of job growth?
They're supposed to be targeting about 5% GDP growth, so about 4 to 5% GDP growth. And what's interesting there, Leon, is that the country actually did achieve that high economic performance. We're going to speak a little bit here about the politics and the polling when we get to that. But a fundamental thing that I would like your listeners and viewers to also see is that South Africans vote according to the material circumstances. As those circumstances improve, they reward the government in power, and as they decline, they punish the government in power. Speaking about 5% GDP growth rate, South Africa actually did see those high levels of economic performance. If you were to look at the country between the years 1994 as well as that of 2008, we doubled the number of people employed, as GDP growth rate between those years averaged about 4 to 5%, and especially eclipsed 5% GDP growth rate between the years 2004 as well as that of 2007. And the consequence of that has been an ANC which saw electoral support in 1994 rise from about 66% to where it was in 2004 rather, at nearly 70%, as people's lives generally improve. Subsequent to those periods, in which between 1998 and 2008, we're creating about 500,000 jobs each and every year, where we currently are right now, since that period, where we're only creating about 130,000 jobs each and every year. The consequence of that has been the ANC polling now in the 40s, from 70% in 2004, a massive decline in its electoral support, largely due to the fact that the number of people employed has stagnated over the number of 17 years or so.
You say polling in the 40s, but has they not dropped below that? I did see some stats a little while ago where it was even shockingly lower.
Yeah, that's actually also a good question. So we have been doing polling since April 15th in regards to the political standing of parties. We've done polling for about 2.5 years now. But in terms of actually tracking the political standing of political parties, we started tracking it 6 weeks before the elections. And what we saw is that people's opinions change over time. That's how polling data works. No one stays on the same opinion for a set number of periods. Things change as the pocketbook also changes. What we saw in this year, when the ANC proposed a 2% VAT hike, is that it absolutely capitulated the support levels to where ANC support declined to about 33% compared to where it was polling in the first 100 days of the GNU, where it was sitting at about 46%. It knocked its support levels down because its voters did not like a VAT hike. These were people that were already struggling, as the GDP performance has struggled to surpass 1% and have struggled to move from the unemployment category, which sits at about 33%, into the employment category. These individuals felt that they were being taxed and their pocketbooks were shrinking, punishing the ANC. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at the polling data between the ANC, which was at 33%, as well as that of the DA, which at the time was sitting at about nearly 30%, the difference between the two was about 14 percentage points. Now, however, as the ANC has walked back the VAT hike, that differential has narrowed to about 4 percentage points, where the ANC support levels have risen to about 40%, while the DA has slightly marginally declined within a margin of error of about 4%, from 30% down to 26%. So it has narrowed. And that's largely with what we're seeing in the polling data, that there's this 1/3 of ANC voter supporters that get shift from the ANC supporting voter bloc depending on the issues tabled by politicians in the day-to-day issues that the country faces. Should politicians take on issues that favor their material circumstances, they vote in that government. And should they pursue issues that shrink their budgets, that shrink their ability to spend, they punish their government. And that's exactly what we saw this year in February, where ANC support was knocked below that 40% mark. Now it has risen, sitting up for about 40%. But the risk now that we've seen over the weekend is that what we see amongst these parties is that the support for the GNU, and particularly for these parties, may weaken should the public see that these politicians have led to the collapse of the GNU. It remains the most popular option on the table. It polls much higher than the ANC and also polls much higher than the DA. In terms of other political parties, we look at the EFF. Their support levels have declined in February from about 9% to 3%, and EFF has eaten a lot of that support from the EFF, where it's now polling at about 18% from about 14% in February.
So what's interesting just on that is that, and maybe it's just coincidental, but when the DA stood up against the VAT hike and was quite public in that regard, their polling seemed to improve. As soon as they were then cooperative again, they tended to lose a little bit. Now, maybe it wasn't because of that. Maybe it was just because of the fact that the ANC got off by reversing the VAT hike. But now the DA is threatening again. They've pulled out of the national dialogue. I'm not certain what this national dialogue was all about. Maybe you can also expand a little bit on that for me. It just sounds to me like a whole lot of money for nothing. But now they're standing up again, and I don't know, will that actually benefit them? Is the DA feeling the impact of cooperation? Is the cooperation really working for them? And that's interesting in the context of when you talk about the fact that the GNU polls highly, because the GNU is not really achieving much. We're not seeing the economic growth coming through. So what's the point? It's no different to what there was before.
Yeah, so that's actually a really good point that you've touched on there in regards to what actually governs the support of the DA. The DA gains a lot of its support when it's seen to be fighting for political cause. It's seen as an opposition kind of vote. Depending on the issue, what we've seen with the VAT, if it's fighting against the VAT hike while majority of South Africans are opposing taxation, be it that of a VAT hike or be it that of other forms of taxation, and the DA is the one that's opposing it, that support largely goes to the DA. And if there's no issue to particularly fight on, then support for the DA slightly marginally declines. So it's largely seen when it's fighting for issues. And if it's not seen, its support levels largely declines. In regards to the GNU, why exactly do people favor the GNU? I think it's very important to look at actually the demographics of the GNU. Before the elections of last year, May, what we polled is that we polled South Africans on the question, is there some good people within the ANC as well as some people good in the DA? Now, should these people form a coalition for the betterment of the country, would you vote for that government coalition? About 67% of white voters said they are good people within the ANC and the DA, and about 65% of black voters said there's good people in both parties, and it would be good for the country for these two parties to form a coalition. And digging a little bit deeper into that, when we look at the demographics as well, such as that of urban-rural split, what we find is that majority of DA supporters dwell in suburbia of South Africa. These are your established middle-income class individuals, and particularly within the ANC, its voter base in the rural areas is largely declining, largely due to the elder generation, unfortunately, passing away in rural parts of the country, such as that of the Eastern Cape, such as that of other rural provinces in the country, while in the urban fringes in the country, such as that of Gauteng, your townships, ANC support dwells in those areas, and that's your aspirant middle-income class. The coalition of these two parties is one of an established middle-income class as well as an aspiring middle-income class, and these two voting blocks are the biggest blocks, voting blocks in the country right now, and they want the same thing. There's no differentiating quality amongst these people. They want a government which will allow for high economic growth levels in the country as well as that of employment. So they like the deal between these two parties forming a coalition together, and that's what governs the support. In the first 100 days of the GNU, we asked the question, is the GNU performing good? And about 58% of registered voters stated that it was performing well. 200 days after that we saw a 10 percentage point decline, where it's now sitting at about 48% of people say that the GNU is performing well. We do see that the support for the GNU has waned, and that's largely reflected due to the economic realities of South Africa. Our employment situation remains stagnant. Unemployment remains high, with a youth unemployment rate of about 70%.
But surely that by cooperating within the GNU for the DA and not being, almost want to say, credible opposition, they get tainted by the same brush. So if the economic growth doesn't come through, they're now equally responsible. That's the reality of it. So what happens if because they must know that they're not stupid. So what happens ultimately when they realize that and they do choose to pull out of the GNU? Because it seems, almost want to say, it seems inevitable.
Yeah, I think if I was a politician right now, I'd be very careful about how I'm positioning this issue. What I would like to avoid as much as possible is to be branded as the individual that breaks apart the GNU, be it that of the DA, be it that of the ANC, because such a consequence would be a grave decline in the party's voter support. That's what I think the DA should try and avoid, and that's what I think the ANC should also try to avoid. Now, we've also polled DA voters on the question, if the DA were to table a motion of no confidence, would you support such a measure if it's just? A large proportion of DA voters would support a motion of no confidence, and we also do see some members within the DA are willing to pull away from GNU, given the fact that Cyril Ramaphosa sacked one of the DA ministers, Andrew Whitfield, and did not meet the concessions or really the ultimatum that the DA proposed towards him. So we can see justifications for the DA wanting to move away from the GNU, given the fact that Cyril, wanting to show power within the executive committee within these parties, sacked one of the DA ministers. However, if I was the DA or that of the ANC, I'd really be careful of how I brand this issue coming towards the removal and dismantlement of the DA within the government of national unity. I do think, though, this was a great gamble taken by Cyril, in that he gambled the branding of the collapsing of the GNU largely to him wanting to demonstrate strength. He was embarrassed given the fact that the DA won on the budget issue, as well as that what we saw with the talks between him and President Trump, as well as now of Starlink. So he wanted to demonstrate strength within a National Executive Committee, which is in favor of actually exiling the DA away from the GNU.
But that's internal politics. I mean, the external perception surely would be that you're showing strength with regards to the other parties, but not your own. Because there's a number of ministers who are under a cloud and that haven't been sanctioned in any way by himself. But it seems to me like it's a game of chess right now. So the ANC is not playing ball as the DA might want. The DA is making lots of threats, but more with the intent of getting kicked out rather than choosing to leave themselves. Do you think that's an accurate sort of depiction?
Yeah, I think that's an accurate picture. I mean, there's a bit of reluctance also within the DA to officially leave the GNU. That was the initial trend that they wanted. They said, if you don't meet our ultimatum, we'll exit the GNU. But they ultimately decided to leave the national dialogue, which by the surface of it isn't anything much of substantial that would lift South Africa's growth rate to where the country needs at about 4%. They did that largely due to the fact that they were concerned that should they do so, the alternative would be that of an EFF or an MK coalition, and MK gaining a lot of momentum currently. So I think there is a few people within the DA that are reluctant to actually leave formally the GNU, but there's some that are actually pushing that narrative. But I think more importantly, for all politicians and policymakers to look at is that fixed investment number. We're talking about opportunities as well. The opportunity for South Africa here, Leon, is that if South Africa maintained the average growth rates that we saw between 1998 as well as that of 2008 of about 4.1% until this day, this would have been a different country. This would have been GDP per capita, the size of the economy divided by the population, which currently sits even below 2008 levels, which is about 78,000. It sits at about 74,000 per person. Would have been 130,000 per person. That's a difference of about 56,000. It's a difference between a family or family member struggling to get ends meet, as well as that of being in the ranks of the upper middle income class society. It's a difference of about currently the number of people employed about 16.7 million, and where we could have been about 21 million South Africans that would have been employed. That's about 4.3 million or so individuals that could have been potential savers, that could have been potential asset holders in the country and drive capital formation in South Africa. But in order for us to achieve that, the opportunity that lays on the table for South Africa is to actually lift the country's fixed investment level from where it currently is at about 15% to where it was even between 2012 and 2007 of about 25%. That's the same as other emerging markets, which will allow a GDP growth rate of about 4 to 5%. And I think the way that we achieve that is we fix our electricity situation, we form a trade deal between the US and South Africa, which would lift investment levels in the country.
So interesting there. I often have this debate. Had we continued to successfully grow the economy, almost automatically economic transformation would have taken place naturally in South Africa. We wouldn't need quotas or triple B or whatever it might be, because the opportunities would have grown and people would have taken those opportunities ultimately. However, we sit, and correct me if I'm wrong here, with a public service bill, which as a percentage of our GDP is one of the highest in the world, if not the highest in the world. So it's almost like economic transformation has happened in the public sector by the lawmakers, but not in the private sector by the man on the street kind of thing. And that's a huge pity because the potential was there. But can we get back on the right path? Because we can talk about growth 4 to 5%.
Yes.
We can have GNUs and say growth is the number one topic on the agenda. We can form national dialogues. But where is the growth? I don't see any firm plans to get that growth on track and so on. And you don't need to look far to get a blueprint. There's many countries you can learn from.
Yeah, I actually think it's very possible for South Africa to achieve the reforms necessary for us to see high economic growth potential. I think it's actually quite easy. Number one, South Africa has sufficient defunct coal power stations that could be refitted to allow a GDP growth rate of about 4%, and then eventually transition to more cleaner forms of energy, such as that of nuclear, such as that of solar as well. So that's the first part. Just on the energy part alone, if we can get our energy availability factor above 60% and maintain it towards 70%, that's above 2% GDP growth rates. The second part is what you've also mentioned here, is that the empowerment policy acts as a tax on the capital that wants to be committed in South Africa and diverts investment away from South Africa. What the government needs to actually do is to incentivize job creation and give tax credits to those firms that want to put their money here in South Africa and want to expand their operations. And in order for them to do so, it also means putting back market value expropriation within the expropriation bill and removing nil compensation. We spent time in DC, we've also spoken to businesses, and businesses tell us that we're not going to commit to a country that has nil compensation and that can take my assets if I invest within the country for the own purposes of the government. And South Africans properly understand that. Within the polling as well, ANC voters don't trust even the ANC with the expropriation with our compensation bill, as well as that they don't view what our empowering policy are to actually be for the betterment of majority of South Africans. About 70% of registered voters say that South Africa's current empowerment policies only benefit the ones that are politically connected, as well as that of the politically elites. These are the issues that South Africans actually understand very well. Actually, let's put picture into what is the potential that this country have. Number one, if also you look at geopolitics currently, if you look at the trade volume passing the Suez Canal, Cape Town has picked up that by almost 3 times the number of ships that are just passing the Cape of Good Hope. But these ships are not parking. They're just passing by and not parking because of South Africa's ports. If we just fix those simple things, and I do think they are simple, I think the fundamental fault with many analysts is that they think this is very much hard work for South Africa to reverse its current trajectory. I think it's very simple to get it right on these issues, and for the next 20 years, to see an unemployment rate trickle down from about 33% to where it should be today, near 10%. Even those numbers that I quoted you for before, with those number of people employed, would have meant an unemployment rate of about 16%. I think South Africa can definitely achieve that, and I think it's definitely easy for policymakers and for business leaders and for as well as that of people with the signing pen of policy to actually achieve those targets.
You say it's easy. I agree with you. It sounds very easy. Yet I was watching the podcast State of the Nation with Mark Sham, and he interviewed,
Yes.
I think it was a speaker of the ANC, and he asked that question about foreign investors and nil compensation and IP being brought to the country, as well as
Yes.
employment equity quotas. And the answer was they can go to India.
India.
So I hear that and I think, whoa, okay, that's quite hard.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, does the ANC appreciate this? Surely they must. I mean, there's so many smart people within that organization, but do they have the will to execute or to start changing some of these, what's the right word, limiting factors, or do they even see it as that? Because you had Cyril double downing on BEE the other day, and how that was necessary to grow the economy.
Yeah, short answer, no. I don't think there's any will to actually move towards the direction that we've spoken of so far. And it's largely due to what you've also mentioned, as well as what I'm seeing now with the Minister of Trade and Industry, where he's saying a deal between the US might be delayed. I don't think people within the ANC are taking this quite seriously, and I don't think they're actually noticing what's actually being laid in front of them. The US currently is actually saying to South Africa, we're willing to trade with you so long as you fix one or two or three things that we're seeing that the country is moving in the wrong direction. And it is indeed moving in the wrong direction. But it's the double downing on the tax on capital investment in the country, as well as that of expropriation or compensation, diverting funds away from South Africa towards India. The US currently commits about $60 billion towards India. That is also a deal that South Africa could definitely clinch should we actually see the political will within the ANC to move in towards that direction. But unfortunately, we're seeing a double down in the policies that have dragged South Africa's economic potential. And right now, I don't see anyone within the ANC administration that's taking this with the level of seriousness that it does need. So unfortunately not. We don't see that political will in the ANC. And it unfortunately means that it's a party that continues to see its support continue to decline. And it shouldn't have declined. They were at 70%, and by our numbers, had they maintained those growth numbers, they actually would have been at 60% last year. They wouldn't have lost last year's election. They would still maintained majorities in Gauteng as well as that of KZN. And that's what they're missing. That's also for them. Yeah,
It's like we're living in the twilight zone, because it does seem so obvious. Yet for some reason, they're ignoring all of these warning signs the whole time. So it's almost as if long-term power or long-term governance is less important than short-term gain. And perhaps that's a bit unfair of me to say, but the reality is I can't find any other reason to sort of justify what is going on at the moment.
There's no other reason besides the doubling down on really bad policy. And it's unfortunate because I am based in California and I see a lot of beautiful things in California. It's a very nice place to live in, but I constantly compare it to South Africa. And I'm saying, if I look at it, California is about 5 times more expensive for the same quality and service that I can get in South Africa. Yeah. In terms of private healthcare, in terms of areas where I can live in terms of the quality of education that also is available in this country. And I look at those things and I say it's just dearly unfortunate that South Africa just simply struggles on the basic fundamental in terms of policy that would allow a lot of that capital to move into South Africa. We have a lot of potential. And I don't think these politicians actually also see that. And unfortunately, it also means the further decline of their support levels.
But I see, this is where I think, and I mean, I've been warned a lot about having some of these conversations. in the corporate sphere. So I think this is where Business South Africa has more of a role to play. But more important than that, I think this is where conversation and dialogue is so important. So we talk about the national dialogue, which I don't buy into, but dialogue between you and I, between you, I, and our viewers, between my son and his friends at their braai tonight, that we are talking about these things without any fear of being branded in any way, but more from the perspective of understanding and sharing and helping each other understand better through the process. I've noticed the number of podcasts that have sprung up over the last while where that dialogue is starting to ultimately take place. It is a bit one-sided, I must be honest. It's a bit of ANC bashing that's going on. But I think that's just because there is a lot of discontent at this point in time. But I think every society where there's open dialogue, where there's sharing, where there's respect for other people's opinions, that is healthy. And South Africa needs that massively at the moment. And that's why I'm so excited about this series going forward and having people like yourself come in. I mean, you're amazing with your numbers. I'd like to see where you've got them all stored in the head over there. That was quite impressive. But to talk about these things and to understand and to keep on informing people so that they can form their own opinions at the end of the day. So on that note, what I'm going to do is I'm going to end today. So thank you. Our time is up. We will see you again in a month, and I'd like to dig into a little bit more around the relationship between, call it, South Africa and the US, and the opportunities that might bring. And hopefully a month down the line, things have progressed a little bit in terms of trade possibility and so on. And then we can also start delving into the investment opportunities and talking a bit more about how to stimulate growth and what the role of business in South Africa ultimately is within that. So Bheki, thank you so much. Closing comment from you before I close off today's interview.
Closing comment from me is that I'd really just wanted to also highlight the opportunities that the country definitely has. We've spoken a lot about others in terms of trade, but I also would like to highlight that if you look at South Africans right now, there's fundamentally no differences among South Africans. We really are a unity kind of society. We do have different cultures, but in terms of the actual values, South Africans want one and the same. And I think that's a very positive note, given that a country that has very high unemployment rates and given that a country that could have been susceptible to violent taking over of an election lost by the ANC, and South Africans chose not to go for that option. I think that's very good, and it's something that's positive and worth looking at by industry leaders as well as that of fund managers. The South Africans are very moderate in their way of thinking. They do want jobs, they want to be savers, they want to be owners of assets, and they want a better life for their families as well as that of their fellow neighbors. I think that's very positive.
That is the best possible ending, and I couldn't agree more. So first of all, thank you very much to the sponsor of the series, Motswedi Economic Transformation Specialists. They're an investment manager who focuses on unlocking opportunities that drive economic growth and transformation, and through that ultimately deliver superior returns to their customers. Bheki from Frans Cronje Private Clients, thank you so much for joining us today. Really looking forward to unpacking this further going forward. This is Leon Greyling. Thank you to our audience for joining us on Power Plays and Paydays here on EBnet Stream. Thank you.
Thank you.